Hello and welcome back to the Life Runners podcast. As promised from last episode, today we are going to be discussing 6 vintage watches that we will be covering on Life on the Wrist over the coming weeks. This is a really exciting episode. For me, I think the pieces that we've gotten in are so varied and so interesting in their own rights. Each piece is so interesting in their own right. And it's just, this is what vintage watches is about, exploring these pieces, understanding the histories of each of them, getting to experience them on the wrist, and also experience learning about each of the individual pieces, I think is what makes vintage watch collecting so exciting. So I will talk through each of the pieces that we've gotten in. I will also say that tomorrow there will be an episode of on the Life on the Wrist YouTube channel where we will show each of the pieces that we discussed today. So if you are subscribed to us over on YouTube, stay tuned for that for tomorrow, where you can actually see these pieces in the metal. As always, there'll be links in the show notes to each of these pieces, so you can see pictures of them. But I do encourage you to check out our video on Life on the Wrist on our Life on the Wrist YouTube channel, because there's nothing like actually seeing these watches tick. And so hopefully that video you will enjoy. But we will go through these pieces in the podcast form. So I'll talk through each of them, give you a little bit of a brief introduction on them and their histories. So hopefully that will at least give you something to enjoy for this podcast, and then you can enjoy the videos that are to come. So we'll start off with a piece that was manufactured, I think, in 1974. It is an Omega de Ville, and I think the reference, and don't quote me on this, I might get this wrong, but it's a 511.0474. This is totally a 1970s piece. What you have is this rectangular, quite long case Omega de Ville that doesn't have any lugs, so it really is a 70s sort of aesthetic when it comes to this kind of tank style piece. But it has a long rectangular case. I think it's 42 millimeters from top to bottom. It then has a really large outer case, both on the top and the bottom of the case, and then a sort of smaller display for where the time is. It's a really beautifully constructed piece, very elegant on the wrist. It has a white dial with Roman numerals that's extremely legible. Obviously is thought of as being something more of a dress piece, but in my mind, you could totally wear this casually with jeans and a t-shirt. It also has a really beautiful, what I believe is the original cabochon crown. So if you're looking for something that is maybe a Cartier tank alternative, this reference is a wonderful example of that. It's a gold-plated case that's actually patinaed a little bit around the crystal of the watch. Super comfortable on the wrist, and at 42 millimeters, I think doesn't fit. It's not going to wear too small. It is, obviously, no lugs makes a watch. A watch with no lugs makes them sit a little bit smaller, but a really beautiful piece, and totally an example of what the 1970s brought in terms of design and what people craved. And I think the 70s was such an interesting time period because it forced brands to innovate when it came to design and style and aesthetics, and both just from the sort of 1970s pop culture, but also, of course, the influence of quartz movements being released and becoming popular during this time period. The next piece that I want to go over is a really incredible stainless steel Girard Perregaux from the 1960s. This is a gyromatic, part of the gyromatic line of watches. For those of you who do not know, gyromatic was essentially the term that Girard Perregaux coined for their automatic movements. Obviously, in the 1950s, automatic movements became sort of the thing to have on the wrist. It allowed wearers to not have to wind their watches, but they were able to simply put it on their wrist and it would continue to tick. And so this technological or function that watches had was really at the forefront of consumers' minds and it was really in demand. And so Girard Perregaux obviously jumped on that train and wanted to have their own automatic movement that would be a part of what consumers had the option of purchasing. And it started off with the, I think, 21 series movements, which I think was a modified e-Bausch that Girard Perregaux used. There are some rumors that those e-Bausches were exclusively sold to Girard Perregaux and only used in Gyromatic watches, and then eventually were offered to other brands. But the watch that we have today has a 32 series, which I think is the generation after the 21 series, and for me is an incredibly beautiful stainless steel watch from Girard Perregaux. I think it's 33 millimeters in diameter. You have a really beautiful case that has signs of wear, but very few signs of polish. The case is extremely strong. Stainless steel case, signed crown. If you look at the dial, you've got an incredibly beautiful white dial with applied silver hour markers, and then you have a date at 3 o'clock. The date is also not distracting for the dial. Normally there would be a sort of a silver outline, or that's what a lot of brands would opt to do. This one actually just has a cutout of where the date is, so it's not distracting to the wearer when looking at the dial. I think this is a beautiful example of what Girard Perregaux was doing, and it's kind of like a no-nonsense stainless steel watch that can be honestly an everyday piece. It's so simple, not overstated, but you can enjoy the watch just like a watch that's got excessive complications because of how beautiful the dial layout and overall condition of the dial is. All right, the third piece I want to discuss is from Universal Genève. So I'm sure that if you are listening to this podcast, you are aware that Breitling has acquired the brand Universal Genève. And obviously a lot of individuals have been, there's two sides of the coin, right? One side is many people are excited to see what Breitling does with the brand. They think that Breitling is the right organization to honor what Universal Genève was during its past, and not make a mockery of the name. Some people are kind of nervous that they're going to mismanage the brand. We'll just have to see. We'll have to give first off, I don't think we're going to see any watches being released anytime soon. We'll have to kind of just wait and see if something will actually come out in the next couple of years and what that will be. I'm sure that they will go with something classic, whether that's going to be from the vintage chronographs like the Unicompacts, Tri-Compacts line, or maybe something that's a time only. We'll have to see. But I think that's gotten people very excited about the direction that Breitling really could take Universal Genève. I think it's important to remember that Universal Genève was a brand that in the 1950s and 60s, they were making really great quality watches, but they were not, highly finished, kind of like Patek Philippe's, or at that time Longines watches were. They were fairly simple movements. Simple, I'm saying that in the relatives, using that as a relative term. But they were making movements that were of great quality, but were not super highly finished. And I think the highly finished piece is something that will be interesting to see if Breitling decides to bring that to the Universal Genève name. But the watch that I have today, and I'm sorry I'm going off on a tangent there, but the watch I have today is a reference 20508. This watch, I believe, was manufactured in 1945. It's a 30 millimeter time-only piece. It's really got a field watch aesthetic to it. What really captures my attention with this watch is the dial. The patinated dial is in incredible condition, super even across the entire dial. The hands have also, in my opinion, I believe they are original because the luminescent material matches the dial extremely well. It's got a 12-hour. It's actually got a 24-hour display. So you've got 12 hours that are sort of a little bit larger, and then you've got hours 13 to 24 that are in red text that are on the outside of the 12 hours that are towards the center of the dial. Stainless steel case, 30 millimeters. It's a little bit smaller. The lugs are fairly long in my view, so it does maybe sit at maybe the equivalent of what a 31 or maybe a 32 millimeter watch would sit at. The watch has been polished. You can see on the top of the case the lugs are a little bit rounded, but when you turn it over, they're sharp towards on the back side of the watch. I think it's a beautiful example of what University of Genève was doing in the 1940s, and having a 24-hour display with an incredibly beautiful patina dial, I think is something that one can enjoy. We'll stay in the 1940s and we'll move over to Longines. Longines is a brand that I speak about a lot. I think the watches that they produced are exceptional. The movements and case designs are really exceptional from the brand. And during this time period, I think they were really a standout when it came to watchmaking. The watch that I have today is from 1942. It's a really interesting sort of, it's not exactly a tank, it's kind of a curved tank style piece with these really sort of straight lugs. They almost look like teeth, but they're extremely straight. The case is overall curved, so it fits nicely on the wrist. But it's quite an interesting sort of case design from the 1940s from Longines. The watch is 10 karat gold filled, and what's really nice about it is it's kind of aged into this pink-ish hue that I think is quite attractive. What's really nice as well is if you look at the dial, which I believe was sunburst when it was originally produced, has also aged to this sort of pink hue, which having a pink dial on a watch is really, really attractive. The watch has applied hour markers, subsidiary seconds at 6 o'clock, and these really thin sort of stick hands. The watch runs in the caliber 9L movement, which is a fairly historic, very well used movement from Longines. They put 9L movements in a lot of their pieces during this era. Overall, I think it's just another example of Longines producing exceptional watches. And, pink dials are obviously very attractive to many. All right, we will go back then to 1938 and talk about a really, really cool piece. This watch, the next watch we're going to discuss, is a Bulova right angle. Now, if you don't know what the Bulova right angle is, the watch has sort of a wedge-shaped case with these beautiful triple-step sides that really make the wedge case extremely attractive and very good looking. The case is curved, so it sits really nicely on the wrist. And this was really an attempt by Bulova to kind of innovate in wristwatches. If you look at the advertisements from Bulova during this time period for this watch, what they actually said was, what they've done with this by having this wedge-shaped case is essentially tilted the dial up. And in their advertising material, they say that it's essentially what they've done is they've tilted the dial so that it's at the right angle to be seen by the wearer, which I think is just so innovative. Many brands have attempted to make watches that are more legible or easier to read. And I think 1938 for Bulova to do this, it was such a functional... It was for a functional reason, right? To be able to read the time in an easier way. But what they created was a design that I think is so unique and so attractive, especially in today's sort of world of collecting, where these sort of oddball case designs are really becoming very, very popular. The watch has a white dial with applied hour markers that remind me of the Breguet numerals of the Patek Philippe, vintage Patek Philippe watches that I absolutely adore. It's got a subsidiary seconds at 6 o'clock. I believe the movement is the caliber 8AZ movement. It was launched in 1938, so this is likely one of the first right angles that they released. Such an attractive design for a case and such an attractive watch to wear on the wrist. I highly encourage you to check out the pictures of this piece because it really is. It was really funny, and I was thinking about this, is if this was signed Patek Philippe, this would be an incredibly rare, incredibly coveted watch, even if it was Patek Philippe or Cartier, you know. But hopefully I can bring some light to the right angle, and maybe more collectors will be interested in these pieces. All right, the last piece I want to discuss is from the line of watches that, for me, has been an integral part of life on the wrist, and that is the Jaeger-LeCoultre Memovoxes or wrist alarms. For those of you who don't know what these pieces are, Jaeger-LeCoultre produced watches that essentially had an alarm embedded in their movements, and it uses a hammer mechanism to essentially hit against the side of the case and make a sound to alert the wearer of some sort of appointment that they wanted to mark with the watch. The watch has this inner disc that you can turn, and that indicates when the alarm will go off. And I've spoken about the JLC Memovoxes and wrist alarms at length on Life on the Wrist, but really the crux of what I discuss is the fact that, to me, I think this is these pieces are some of the best watches that money can buy when it comes to vintage watches. What you're essentially getting is a striking mechanism in an extremely attractive case. That is really, for me, when I think about it, was extremely innovative for the brand. And again, similar to things like the right angle, it was a function that came about because there was a necessity for it. And I think that's just so cool. Also, if you think about other watches that have striking mechanisms, you think of minute repeaters, which are obviously very coveted by collectors. Minute repeaters, or just repeater watches in general. So what you're getting is something that's almost equivalent in function to that, but in a relatively, let's say, a more approachable. It's a much more approachable piece than getting something like a minute repeater. The watch that we have today is kind of the genesis of these pieces. It's the reference 3150. This was the original reference that Jaeger-LeCoultre launched, I think in 1951 at Basel World, to showcase the watch that they were releasing, which is this wrist alarm, which I think makes this watch really special because we obviously have had a couple of these that we've covered on Life on the Wrist, but we haven't had sort of the genesis, the watch that started it all, and so it's really cool that we have the reference 3150 that we can cover now. The piece has a stainless steel case with what was obviously in the reference 3150s, these really interesting tubed lugs that integrate sort of on the underside of the case. Please check out the pictures of this watch because it's quite different than what you probably have seen before. This wasn't the first time that Jaeger-LeCoultre used these tubed lugs. They did use them in some time-only pieces, I think in the late 1940s. So adapted from those pieces. The watch has a white dial that's patinaed very nicely. I think has aged to a really nice color. The watch has what I believe is replacement hands. They're in sort of a sword shape, but the color of the luminescent material doesn't exactly match that of the hour markers, so I definitely think those are replaced. Additionally, I think the crowns are not original. They're unsigned. I think the 3150s were released with signed crowns, so those are also likely replacements. The alarm sounds really, really loudly, really attractive to me, and such a cool way of experiencing this watch that I have, I've spoken about at length and really am a huge advocate about these pieces. And so it's going to be nice to cover this specific watch to sort of round out what I love about the Memovoxes and wrist alarms that were released by JLC and really representative of this era. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about all these pieces. I think that will do it for this week's episode of the podcast. As always, there'll be links in the show notes of this podcast for you to go and see some pictures of these pieces. I encourage you to do it while we sort of talk through each of them if you are able to. For me, of this lineup, I really love the Omega. I think the DeVille is such a cool piece. And then I think the right angle and the Memovox or wrist alarm are also standouts for me in this sort of lineup of pieces. But I would love to hear which one of these pieces is your favorite. So let me know. There's no comments, except the podcast is on Spotify, and I know that there's a function where you can add a comment on Spotify. So if you are listening to this on Spotify, leave a comment there. But if you are on, let's say, Apple Podcasts, go to the show notes. You can hit us up on Instagram or lifeonthewrist.com or on any of our social medias. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these pieces. If you are new to the Life on the Wrist podcast, be sure to follow us so you are notified when we upload on a weekly basis. And if you are feeling generous and wouldn't mind sharing this with a friend who might be interested in watches, and if you wouldn't mind rating this podcast, it really does help me out. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.